Richard Hunter stood at the edge of his penthouse balcony, 40 stories above Manhattan, watching the city lights flicker like stars beneath him. His fingers tightened around the crystal tumbler of 30-year-old scotch, a drink worth more than what most people earned in a day. At 52, he had amassed a fortune that placed him firmly among the elite of New York's billionaires. Hunter Tech Industries had revolutionized artificial intelligence security systems, and every major corporation in the world now paid handsomely for his patented technologies. But tonight, despite the panoramic view of his empire, Richard felt hollow. The board meeting earlier had been another triumph, stock prices soaring, international expansion proceeding ahead of schedule. Yet he had walked out of that boardroom and felt absolutely nothing. His phone vibrated against the marble tabletop behind him. Richard ignored it. It was probably Melissa, his executive assistant, with another crisis that needed his immediate attention. Or perhaps one of his rotating cast of girlfriends, all stunning, all accomplished, and all ultimately interchangeable in his life. The vibration stopped, then immediately began again. Sighing, Richard turned and reached for the device. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number with a Cincinnati area code. For a moment, his finger hovered over the decline button, but something, intuition perhaps, made him answer. "Hunter," he stated flatly. At first there was only silence. Then a small voice, a child's voice, unmistakably, broke through. "Daddy, the doctor says I need you." Richard's body went rigid, the tumbler slipping from his fingers and shattering on the marble floor. The voice was small, female, fragile, and completely unfamiliar. "Who is this?" he demanded, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. A shuffle on the other end, and then an adult woman's voice replaced the child's. "Mr. Hunter, this is Dr. Sarah Whitman from Cincinnati Children's Hospital. I'm sorry for the unorthodox introduction, but I'm calling about Emily Collins. She's 8 years old and she needs your help urgently." The doctor's voice was professional but strained with what sounded like exhaustion and concern. "I don't know any Emily Collins," Richard replied coldly, although something about the name Collins caused a long-buried memory to stir in the recesses of his mind. "Her mother is Katherine Collins," the doctor continued. "She says you knew each other approximately 9 years ago." Katherine Collins. The name hit Richard like a physical blow. Images flooded back. Katherine with her artist's hands and infectious laugh, the 6-month affair during his company's expansion to the Midwest, the bitter argument when he'd ended things after she'd grown too attached. She had been different from his usual type, more genuine, less impressed by his wealth. And now this call, 9 years later, with a child calling him daddy. "That's impossible," Richard whispered. But even as he said it, he was calculating dates in his head. "Mr. Hunter," Dr. Whitman spoke softly now. "Emily has a rare form of leukemia. She needs a bone marrow transplant. Katherine is not a match, and we've exhausted the donor registry options. We need to test direct relatives, if you are her father. My name is Theo Teller, and if this introduction has already sparked your curiosity, leave your like to follow the unfolding of this extraordinary journey. If you've ever had your life turned upside down by an unexpected phone call, subscribe now to the channel and share in the comments the most shocking news you've ever received, just like our protagonist is experiencing right now. Also, let me know which city you're watching this story from. Each message and subscription gives me strength to bring more stories that will touch your emotions. Richard paced the length of his penthouse living room, his perfectly tailored suit jacket discarded on the Italian leather sofa. 3 hours had passed since the phone call, and his world had been thrown into chaos. He had immediately dispatched his company jet to Cincinnati. It would be waiting for him at Teterboro Airport within the hour. But before he left, he needed information. "Find me everything on Katherine Collins in Cincinnati, Ohio," he barked into his phone. James, his head of security, didn't question the urgency in his voice. Richard had built his empire on swift decisions and unwavering action. Hesitation was for the weak, and Richard Hunter was anything but weak. And a child, Emily Collins, 8 years old. patient at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. I want a complete background, medical records, everything. And James, this stays between us." While he waited, Richard pulled up his private calendar from 9 years ago. There it was, a 3-month project overseeing the Cincinnati office expansion. He had stayed at the Netherland Plaza, had dinner at Orchids at Palm Court, attended endless meetings with local officials, and then he had met Katherine at a gallery opening. She was showcasing her sculptures, haunting pieces of twisted metal and glass that had captured his attention almost as much as her quiet confidence and lack of pretense. Their affair had been intense, but temporary. At least that's what he had told her from the beginning. Katherine had accepted his terms until she hadn't. The final night, when she tearfully confessed her feelings, he had walked away without looking back. He had never considered consequences beyond the moment. That was how he lived his life, moving forward, never backward. His phone rang. James had been efficient, as always. Katherine Collins, 43, art professor at the University of Cincinnati. Previously a working artist with moderate success in the Midwest gallery scene. Single mother to Emily Collins, born August 17, 8 years ago. James paused meaningfully. The birth certificate lists the father as unknown. Richard's throat tightened. The timing aligned perfectly. And the medical situation. Emily was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia 7 months ago. Aggressive form. She's undergone 3 rounds of chemotherapy with limited success. The doctors have recommended a bone marrow transplant as her best chance for survival. Her mother was tested, but is not a compatible donor. The clinical description couldn't mask the gravity of the situation. A child, possibly his child, was fighting for her life. "What are the odds without a compatible donor?" Richard asked, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. James hesitated before answering. "The reports indicate less than 20% chance of 5-year survival." Richard ended the call and walked to his bedroom. He threw essentials into a carry-on bag, a routine he had perfected during years of international business travel. His mind raced through scenarios, contingencies, potential outcomes. This was how he approached business problems, but this wasn't business. This was a child's life, possibly his child. As his driver navigated through the late-night Manhattan traffic toward the airport, Richard stared at his phone. He had pulled up a photo of Katherine from her university profile. Older now, her dark hair shorter than he remembered, but with the same intelligent eyes. Next to her faculty picture was a link to a department event. And there, in a group photo of an art workshop for children, he spotted a small girl with auburn hair and a serious expression. Something in the set of her jaw, the analytical gaze as she concentrated on her sculpture. It was disturbingly familiar. He saw it every morning in his own mirror. His phone buzzed with an incoming text from Dr. Whitman. "Katherine and Emily are expecting you tomorrow. Emily is stable for now. Thank you for coming." Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility descend upon him like never before. Billions in corporate assets, thousands of employees worldwide. He had never shied away from responsibility on a grand scale, but the life of one small girl, that was entirely different territory. Cincinnati Children's Hospital stood like a beacon of hope amidst the morning mist. Richard strode through the gleaming lobby, the confidence in his gait masking the turmoil within. He'd spent the pre-dawn hours in his hotel suite, reviewing every scrap of information James had collected on Emily's condition, calling specialists from New York to Tokyo, demanding opinions, treatment plans, success rates. Control. He needed control of the situation. But as the elevator ascended to the pediatric oncology floor, Richard realized he was entering a world where his money and influence might not bend reality to his will. The elevator doors opened to a corridor awash in soft blues and cheerful yellows, walls adorned with children's artwork, a stark contrast to the sterile corporate environments he typically navigated. Dr. Whitman, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, met him at the nurse's station. "Mr. Hunter, thank you for coming so quickly. She extended her hand, her grip firm and professional. "I want to see all her medical records first," Richard replied, bypassing pleasantries. "I've consulted with specialists at Memorial Sloan Kettering. If Emily needs to be transferred to New York—" Dr. Whitman's expression remained composed, but her eyes hardened slightly. "We can certainly discuss treatment options, Mr. Hunter, but first, there's the matter of paternity confirmation, and perhaps more importantly, there's a little girl who has been asking about you since dawn." Richard felt a flush of embarrassment, an unfamiliar sensation for a man accustomed to dictating terms in every interaction. He nodded curtly, allowing Dr. Whitman to lead him to a private consultation room where a nurse was already waiting with testing supplies. "A simple cheek swab," Dr. Whitman explained. "We'll rush the results, but given the circumstances, we'd like to proceed as if you are Emily's father. Katherine has agreed to meet with you after we've drawn blood to test your marrow compatibility. Regardless of the paternity test outcome, you could still be a potential donor." As the nurse collected the samples, Richard found himself uncharacteristically at a loss for words. He had rehearsed various scenarios on the flight, confronting Katherine about her failure to inform him about the pregnancy, demanding verification of his paternity before making any commitments, establishing clear boundaries about his involvement moving forward. But the clinical reality of the situation, the blood vials, the consent forms, the hushed medical terminology, stripped away his practiced business persona. "How bad is it?" he finally asked Dr. Whitman after the nurse had left. "Don't sanitize it." Dr. Whitman regarded him thoughtfully, as if deciding how much this man could handle. "Emily has a particularly aggressive form of AML, acute myeloid leukemia. She initially responded well to chemotherapy, but the cancer has returned more aggressively. Her best chance is a bone marrow transplant, and quickly. She's a fighter, Mr. Hunter. She hasn't given up, not for a moment. And Katherine, how is she handling this?" Something flickered across Dr. Whitman's face. Respect, perhaps. "She's been extraordinary. Working reduced hours to be here every day, sleeping in that uncomfortable chair by Emily's bed, researching treatment options, organizing fundraisers to help with medical bills." She paused. "It hasn't been easy financially." The implication hung in the air. While Richard had been amassing billions, Katherine had been struggling to save their daughter alone. "Take me to them," Richard said, his voice low. Dr. Whitman nodded and led him down the corridor to a room near the end. She knocked gently, then opened the door. The room was small but private, filled with evidence of long-term occupancy. Hand-drawn pictures covered one wall. Stuffed animals and books cluttered the windowsill. In a recliner by the window sat Katherine, older than in his memories but still striking. Her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, shadows beneath her eyes testifying to countless sleepless nights. And in the bed, looking impossibly small amid the machines and monitors, was Emily. Her auburn hair was gone, her complexion pale, but her eyes, Richard felt his breath catch. They were his eyes, unmistakably, looking back at him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Katherine stood slowly, her body tense. 9 years of silence stretched between them like a chasm. "Hello, Richard," she said simply, her voice betraying nothing of what this moment must cost her. Before Richard could respond, Emily's small voice filled the room. "Are you really my dad?" The directness of the question, delivered with such innocent gravity, pierced through every defense Richard had constructed on his journey here. In boardrooms across the globe, he was known for his quick, incisive responses, but facing this child, his child, words failed him completely. The silence in Emily's hospital room stretched uncomfortably until Richard finally found his voice. "Yes," he said quietly, the word emerging with unexpected certainty. "I believe I am." Emily studied him with an intensity that belied her 8 years, her gaze taking in his expensive suit, his watch, his perfectly trimmed hair. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. a fragile but genuine smile that transformed her pale face. "I knew you'd come someday," she said simply. "Mom has your picture in her memory box. I found it last year. You look older now, but your eyes are the same as mine." Katherine made a small sound, halfway between a laugh and a sob, and turned away, pretending to adjust Emily's pillows. Richard recognized it as a moment of private composure, something he'd mastered himself over decades of high-stakes negotiations. "Emily," Dr. Whitman interjected gently, "why don't we let your mom and Mr. Hunter talk for a few minutes? I need to check your latest blood work anyway." Emily's expression turned serious again. "Are you going to help me get better?" she asked Richard directly, ignoring the doctor's suggestion. The directness of the question caught him off guard again. In that moment, he recognized something of himself in her, the refusal to dance around difficult subjects, the need to address the core issue immediately. "I'm going to do everything I can," Richard answered, surprising himself with his candor. Emily seemed satisfied with this response. She allowed Dr. Whitman to help her into a wheelchair, a stuffed otter clutched in her thin arms. 20 minutes, Dr. Whitman said to Katherine. "Then we need to start the next round of tests." When the door closed behind them, the air in the room seemed to thicken. Katherine moved to the window, her back to Richard, arms crossed protectively across her chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out more accusatory than he'd intended. Katherine turned, her expression tightly controlled. "Would it have mattered, Richard? You made it abundantly clear that night that you didn't want attachments, that your life had no room for anything beyond your next business conquest." "That wasn't your decision to make," he countered, feeling the familiar surge of control returning. "She's my daughter too." "Is she?" Katherine challenged, her voice low but intense. "Because until yesterday she was just my daughter. Mine to raise, mine to comfort when she cried for a father she'd never met, mine to hold through chemo treatments and fevers and nights when the pain was so bad she couldn't sleep." Richard absorbed the blow, recognizing the truth in her words. "I would have provided financial support. At minimum." Katherine's laugh was bitter. "I didn't want your money, Richard. I never did. That's why you liked me in the first place, remember? The rare woman who wasn't impressed by Richard Hunter's billions." She was right, and they both knew it. Katherine had been refreshingly indifferent to his wealth, more interested in his faults on art and philosophy than his business empire. It had been intriguing, then frustrating when the relationship deepened beyond his comfort zone. "What matters now is Emily," Richard said, deliberately steering the conversation back to safer ground. "Dr. Whitman says I might be a compatible donor." Katherine's anger seemed to deflate, replaced by the weary concern he'd glimpsed earlier. "The transplant is her best chance. The chemotherapy isn't working anymore." Richard moved to the wall covered with Emily's drawings, landscapes, animals, abstract swirls of color, and one that caught his eye. A family portrait. 3 figures stood hand in hand, a woman with dark hair, a small child, and a tall man with a question mark for a face. "She's talented," he said softly. "She gets that from me," Katherine replied, a hint of her old spark returning. "Her stubbornness and analytical mind, that's all you." A tentative truce settled between them, forged by their shared concern for Emily. Richard turned back to Katherine, really seeing her for the first time since he'd entered the room. The strength in her posture, despite obvious exhaustion, the determined set of her jaw. "I'm sorry," he said, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. "Not for what happened between us, but for not being here all these years. Stories like this remind us of the power of second chances. If you believe in them, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next." Katherine's expression softened slightly. "She's been asking about you more since she got sick, as if facing her mortality made her need to understand where she came from, who she came from." Richard felt something shift inside him, a recognition that all his wealth, his power, his carefully constructed empire meant nothing in this moment. For the first time in decades, he was being judged on a metric he had never valued: his capacity for human connection. "I'd like to get to know her," he said carefully, "if you'll allow it." Katherine studied him, searching for sincerity or calculation in his expression. "This isn't a business transaction, Richard. You can't just acquire a relationship with your daughter and then divest when it becomes inconvenient. She's already fighting for her life. I won't let you break her heart, too." Before Richard could respond, the door opened and Dr. Whitman returned with Emily, who looked even more tired than before. "I'm afraid we need to proceed with the blood work now, Mr. Hunter," Dr. Whitman said, "and Emily needs her rest." Emily looked up at Richard, her eyes too old for her young face. "Will you come back tomorrow?" The question hung in the air between them, simple but weighted with implications. It wasn't just about tomorrow, and they all knew it. Richard's limousine idled outside the hospital as night fell over Cincinnati. Inside the vehicle, he sat perfectly still, his phone forgotten in his hand. The blood tests had been taken. The initial compatibility screening rushed through the lab. Tomorrow morning, they would know if he could be Emily's donor. The paternity test would take slightly longer, but Richard no longer needed scientific confirmation of what he had recognized the moment he looked into Emily's eyes. His phone buzzed. James, with the additional information he had requested on Katherine's financial situation. The picture wasn't pretty. An associate professor's salary stretched to its breaking point by medical bills, even with insurance. Her small house was heavily mortgaged, her credit cards maxed out. She had sold most of her artwork and taken advances on her salary. There was a GoFundMe page set up by her colleagues that had raised a modest sum. All this while, he had multiple homes he rarely visited and a fleet of vehicles he barely drove. Another text appeared, his COO asking about the Tokyo merger call scheduled for tomorrow morning. Richard stared at the message, the familiar demands of his empire suddenly seeming trivial compared to what awaited him in that hospital room. "Cancel everything for the next week," he typed back. "Family emergency." Family? The word felt foreign as he wrote it. Richard Hunter didn't have family. He had business associates, temporary companions, and service staff. His parents were long dead. His brief marriage in his 20s, childless and quickly dissolved. He had built his life around the acquisition of power and wealth, not relationships. "Take me to the residence at Montgomery," he instructed his driver, referring to the city's most exclusive hotel. At the hotel, he declined the manager's effusive welcome and went directly to his suite. There, he poured himself a drink, but left it untouched as he stood at the window, looking out at the Cincinnati skyline, so different from his Manhattan view, yet suddenly more significant. His phone rang again. Katherine's name appeared on the screen. He had programmed it in earlier. "Emily wants to know if you like otters," Katherine said without preamble when he answered. "She's worried you might be a penguin person instead," which would be, in her words, not necessarily a deal breaker, but definitely a point of serious concern. Despite everything, Richard found himself smiling. "I have no strong opinions on aquatic mammals. I'm willing to be converted to Team Otter." Katherine's small laugh sounded genuine. "Good answer. She's been talking about you non-stop since you left. I think she's building you up into some kind of superhero." "That's concerning." "It is," Katherine agreed, her voice turning serious again. "Richard, I need to be clear about something. If you're going to be in her life, even just through this medical crisis, you need to be reliable. She's already idealizing you. The reality of who you are needs to be something she can depend on." The implicit criticism stung, but Richard recognized its validity. Reliability to Emily would mean something very different than reliability in business, where his word was considered unbreakable when it suited him, and contracts were renegotiated when they didn't. "I understand," he said simply. A long pause followed before Katherine spoke again. "The nurses said you brought in specialists from around the world today, that you're looking into experimental treatments if the transplant doesn't work." "Yes." "Thank you," she said quietly. "But Richard, she's not just a problem to solve. Your money and connections can help, but what she needs most is humanity." After they hung up, Richard sat in the darkened hotel suite, Katherine's words echoing in his mind. Humanity. It had been so long since anyone had expected that of him. In the rarefied air of billion-dollar deals and corporate takeovers, humanity was often a liability, not an asset. He opened his laptop and began to research, not medical treatments this time, but otters. Their habitats, behaviors, conservation status. If Emily wanted to talk otters, he would be prepared. The next morning, Richard arrived at the hospital earlier than expected. He had stopped at a boutique toy store that had opened early at his request and generous compensation. Now, as he walked down the hospital corridor, he carried a large stuffed otter wearing a miniature business suit, custom-made overnight by the store's bemused staff. He paused outside Emily's room, hearing voices inside. Emily's high, clear tones and Katherine's softer responses. They were reading together, a story about a princess who built robots. Richard found himself lingering, listening to this simple ritual that represented a kind of intimacy he had never experienced. "The princess doesn't need rescuing," Emily was saying. "She's the one who does the rescuing." "That's why I like this story," Katherine replied. "It shows that strength comes in many forms." Richard knocked gently on the doorframe. Emily looked up, her face lighting with a smile that seemed to transform her from patient to simply child. "You came back," she exclaimed. "I said I would," Richard replied, stepping into the room and feeling strangely self-conscious about the stuffed otter. He was accustomed to commanding rooms full of executives, not navigating the emotional terrain of a child's hospital room. Emily spotted the toy and her eyes widened. Is that an otter in a suit?" "I thought he might keep you company during treatments," Richard said, handing it to her. "His name is, well, that's for you to decide." Emily took the otter with reverent hands, examining the tiny suit with its miniature tie and pocket square. "He looks like a businessman," she said thoughtfully. "Like you." She looked up at Richard with sudden inspiration. "I'll call him Richard Jr." Katherine made a choked sound that might have been suppressed laughter. Richard shot her a look that was half amusement, half dismay. Dr. Whitman entered the room, a tablet in her hands and a carefully neutral expression on her face. Richard felt his body tense, recognizing the look of a professional about to deliver significant news. "We have the preliminary compatibility results," she said, looking between Richard and Katherine. "Mr. Hunter, you're a match. Not perfect, but close enough for the transplant to have an excellent chance of success." Emily hugged Richard Jr. to her chest, her eyes suddenly bright with hope. "See, I told you he'd help fix me," she said to her mother. Katherine's eyes met Richard's over their daughter's head, a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and lingering wariness in her gaze. Richard felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, a sensation that took him a moment to identify as something beyond satisfaction or accomplishment. It was purpose, he realized. For the first time in longer than he could remember, his existence had meaning beyond the accumulation of wealth and power. He could save his daughter's life. But as Emily chatted excitedly about how brave Richard Jr. would be during her new blood day, Richard became acutely aware that the transplant was just the beginning. The real challenge would be figuring out what came after, what kind of father he could be to this remarkable child who had summoned him with a simple, life-changing phone call. The week leading up to the transplant proceeded in a blur of medical consultations, paperwork, and preparations. Richard had established a temporary office in his hotel suite, where he divided his time between managing his company remotely and researching everything about bone marrow donation and recovery. Control through knowledge. It was how he had always operated. On his third day in Cincinnati, as he prepared to visit Emily, his phone rang with a call he'd been expecting but dreading. "The paternity test results are back, Mr. Hunter," Dr. Whitman said. "I thought you might want to know before you arrive at the hospital today." Richard gripped the phone tighter. "And?" 99.9% positive. Emily is your biological daughter." Although he had already accepted this truth emotionally, the scientific confirmation still hit him with unexpected force. He thanked the doctor, ended the call, and sat heavily on the edge of his bed, staring at nothing. Emily Collins Hunter, his daughter, his blood. When he arrived at the hospital an hour later, he found Emily's room empty. Panic flashed through him before a nurse explained that Emily was in the playroom, a good sign that she was feeling well enough for activity today. Richard found his way to a brightly colored room filled with toys, books, and art supplies. Several children in various stages of treatment occupied the space, but his eyes immediately found Emily. She sat at a small table with another child, a boy perhaps a year or two younger, his head also bald from treatment. Between them was a chessboard. Richard hung back, watching as Emily studied the board with intense concentration. Her brow furrowed in the exact way his did when he analyzed complex market projections. The boy across from her looked increasingly nervous as she deliberated. Finally, Emily moved her knight, capturing the boy's bishop. "Check," she announced. The boy groaned good-naturedly. "You're too good, Emily. No fair." Emily shrugged, but couldn't hide her pleased smile. "My mom taught me. She says chess helps you see all the possible futures." "My mom just lets me play video games," the boy replied, making a hurried move to escape the check. Emily immediately countered, pushing her queen forward. "Checkmate." The boy studied the board, then sighed dramatically and flopped back in his chair. "Someday I'll beat you." "Keep practicing, Zach," Emily encouraged, already resetting the pieces. "Want to play again?" It was then that Emily noticed Richard standing in the doorway. Her face brightened, and she waved him over enthusiastically. "Dad, come meet my friend Zach. He has lymphoma, but he's almost done with his treatments." "Dad?" The word sent a jolt through Richard's system. It was the first time she had called him that directly, not just referred to him as her father. He approached the table, extending his hand formally to the young boy. "Pleased to meet you, Zach. I'm Richard Hunter." Zach's eyes widened as he shook Richard's hand. "Whoa, are you the Richard Hunter? The AI security guy? My dad has your system at his company." Richard was taken aback. He rarely encountered children who recognized him, especially in this context. "Zach's dad works for SyncTech," Emily explained proudly. "I told him you're my dad yesterday and he didn't believe me." Well, I believe you now," Zach said, impressed. He turned to Richard. "Emily's the smartest person in the whole hospital, even smarter than some of the doctors, but don't tell them I said that." A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Zach, time for your treatment." The boy groaned, but stood obediently. "Rematch tomorrow?" he asked Emily. "You're on," she agreed. As Zach left, Emily turned her attention to Richard. "Do you play chess?" "I do," Richard replied, taking the seat Zach had vacated. "I played competitively in college." Emily's eyes lit up with interest. "Mom says you went to Harvard. Was it hard to get in?" The question surprised him. "It was challenging but rewarding." "I want to go to Harvard someday," Emily declared, rearranging the chess pieces with practiced precision. "Or maybe MIT. I haven't decided yet." Richard felt something between amusement and pride. "You've given this some thought." "Well, I have to get better first," Emily said matter-of-factly. "Doctor, Whitman says your bone marrow cells will help my body make healthy blood again. She looked up at him, suddenly serious. Does it hurt to give bone marrow? The directness of the question caught Richard off guard again. He had read all the medical literature, knew the procedure involved inserting large needles into his pelvic bone to extract the marrow. It might be uncomfortable, he admitted, deciding honesty was important. But it's nothing compared to what you've been going through. Emily nodded solemnly. Mom says sometimes the most important things are the hardest. She moved a pawn forward to open the game. Your move. As they played, Richard discovered that Emily was indeed talented, not just for her age, but objectively skilled. She played with a strategic foresight that both impressed and unsettled him. It was like seeing his own mind at work across the board. Checkmate in 3 moves, he said, after her latest move revealed her strategy. Emily frowned, studying the board. You're right, she conceded, not angry but analytical. I underestimated your queen's position. She reset the board. Again. Katherine found them there an hour later, deep into their 3rd game. She paused in the doorway, watching the matched intensity in their expressions. Richard sensed her presence and looked up. Emily's quite the chess player, he said. She gets that from you too, apparently, Katherine replied, a complex emotion in her voice. The paternity results came back? Richard nodded. Dr. Whitman called this morning. Something shifted in Katherine's expression. A final release of doubt, perhaps. She joined them at the table, placing a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Dad almost beat me that time, Emily reported, eyes still on the board. But I found the counterattack. Katherine's eyes met Richard's over their daughter's head. A silent acknowledgement passed between them, the significance of that word, Dad, and all it entailed. Mr. Hunter, a new voice interrupted. A serious-looking man in a white coat stood in the doorway. Dr. Chen, the transplant specialist Richard had consulted with yesterday. Could I speak with you and Ms. Collins privately? Richard felt a chill of apprehension. Doctors didn't interrupt with good news. Keep practicing, he told Emily, who nodded without looking up from the board, already planning her next game. In the hallway, Dr. Chen got straight to the point. We've discovered a complication in Emily's latest blood work. Her white cell count has dropped dramatically since yesterday, and there are signs of infection beginning. Katherine's hand flew to her mouth. What does that mean for the transplant? We need to move quickly, Dr. Chen replied gravely. Chen's expression was carefully measured. Emily's a fighter, as you know, but I won't sugarcoat this. We're racing against time now. When the doctor left, Katherine and Richard stood in silence, the gravity of the situation settling around them. Finally, Katherine spoke, her voice barely audible. She can't die, Richard. She can't. Richard had built his fortune on calculated risks, on analyzing probabilities and acting decisively. But this wasn't business. This was his daughter's life, hanging in the balance, and all his wealth and power felt suddenly insignificant. She won't, he said with a conviction he hadn't known he possessed. I promise you, Katherine, our daughter is going to live. The hospital took on an eerie calm as night descended. Richard lay in a bed in the donor preparation unit, various IVs attached to his arms delivering medications to optimize his marrow for harvesting. Through the window he could see the Cincinnati skyline illuminated against the darkness, so different from his Manhattan view, yet now infinitely more significant. His phone buzzed on the bedside table. It was a text from James. Tokyo merger completed successfully. Board concerned about your extended absence. Rumors starting. Richard started to type a response, then stopped. For the first time in his career, he didn't care about market rumors or board concerns. He put the phone down without replying and stared at the ceiling. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Katherine stood in the doorway, looking exhausted. "Emily's finally asleep," she said, stepping inside. "The fever's still climbing, but they've started stronger antibiotics." Richard nodded, watching as Katherine sank into the visitor's chair beside his bed. The awkwardness that had characterized their initial reunion had gradually given way to a fragile alliance born of shared concern. "She wanted me to check on you," Katherine continued, "to make sure you weren't scared about tomorrow." Despite everything, Richard felt a smile tug at his lips. "And what did you tell her?" "That Richard Hunter doesn't get scared," Katherine replied, a hint of their old familiarity surfacing. "That's still true, isn't it? The fearless titan of industry?" Richard considered the question seriously. "I've never been afraid of business risks. Financial loss, public failure. Those are just data points, opportunities to recalibrate." He met Katherine's gaze directly. "But this..." "Yes, I'm terrified." The admission hung in the air between them, perhaps the most honest thing he had ever said to her. "So am I," Katherine whispered, the facade of strength slipping momentarily. "Every single day since her diagnosis." A nurse entered with another bag of medication for Richard's IV, interrupting the moment. After she left, Katherine stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city. "9 years ago," she began without turning, "when I found out I was pregnant, I spent weeks trying to decide whether to tell you." Her voice was steady. "Matter of fact, I knew what you'd offer. Financial support, maybe visitation on your terms. But I wanted more for my child than to be a line item in Richard Hunter's portfolio." Richard felt a flash of anger. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Katherine turned to face him. "Look me in the eye and tell me you would have wanted active fatherhood 9 years ago. Tell me you would have changed diapers, attended preschool plays, dealt with tantrums and nightmares." Richard couldn't hold her gaze. The truth was, he wouldn't have. 9 years ago, his sole focus had been building Hunter Tech into a global empire. A child would have been an inconvenience to be managed, not embraced. "Maybe you're right," he conceded. "But people change." "Do they?" Katherine challenged, though her tone held more curiosity than bitterness. "Or do circumstances just force them to reveal parts of themselves they've kept hidden?" Richard considered this. He had often prided himself on his consistency, his unwavering pursuit of success. Had this capacity for connection, for love, been buried within him all along? Before he could respond, his phone rang. The hospital's main number appeared on the screen. He answered quickly, dread pooling in his stomach. "Mr. Hunter," Dr. Whitman's voice was tense. "We need you to come to Emily's room immediately." Richard was already pulling out his IV lines before she finished speaking. "What's happened?" "Her fever has spiked dramatically. We're moving her to the ICU." Katherine was already at the door, her face drained of color. A nurse appeared, protesting Richard's removal of the medical equipment, but he ignored her, grabbing a robe and following Katherine into the hallway. They ran through the quiet corridors, the hospital's nighttime hush shattered by the urgent activity emanating from Emily's room. Medical staff moved with controlled urgency around her bed. Through the chaos, Richard caught glimpses of his daughter, her face flushed with fever, her breathing labored, an oxygen mask now covering her face. Dr. Whitman met them at the doorway, her expression grave. "The infection has accelerated. Her immune system is essentially non-existent at this point." "What does this mean for tomorrow?" Katherine asked, her voice breaking. "We need to stabilize her before we can proceed with the transplant," Dr. Whitman explained. "If we don't get the infection under control, then do it," Richard interrupted, an edge of command in his voice. "Whatever it takes, whatever it costs. Bring in specialists, experimental treatments, anything." Dr. Whitman regarded him with a mixture of sympathy and professional distance. "Mr. Hunter, I understand your impulse, but this isn't a problem that money can necessarily solve. Emily's body is fighting a complex battle on multiple fronts." As if to underscore the doctor's point, alarms began to sound from Emily's monitors. Dr. Whitman rushed back to the bedside, barking orders as nurses responded with practiced efficiency. Richard and Katherine were ushered to a corner of the room, united in their helplessness as they watched medical professionals fight for their daughter's life. Katherine's hand found Richard's, gripping it with desperate strength. After what seemed like an eternity, the alarms quieted. Dr. Chen approached them, his expression carefully neutral. "We've stabilized her for now, but we need to make a decision." He looked between them. "The infection is aggressive. If we wait for it to clear completely before the transplant, it might be too late. But proceeding with the transplant while she's fighting an infection carries significant risks as well." "What would you do if she were your child?" Richard asked bluntly. Dr. Chen didn't hesitate. "I'd proceed with the transplant. Tonight." Katherine gasped softly. "Is that even possible? The preparation, it's not ideal," Dr. Chen acknowledged. "But Mr. Hunter's preliminary preparation should be sufficient, and we can accelerate the harvest procedure. It means increased discomfort for you," he said, addressing Richard directly, "and higher risks for Emily, but waiting might be the greater risk." "Do it," Richard said immediately. Katherine looked at him, then back to Emily's unconscious form. "What are her chances if we do this now?" Dr. Chen's honesty was brutal and necessary. "With the infection, the success rate drops to about 40%. But if we wait and the infection worsens, those odds will drop much further." Katherine closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. "Prepare for the transplant." The next hours passed in a blur of urgent activity. Richard was taken to surgery, where, under local anesthesia, large needles extracted the life-giving marrow from his hip bones. The pain was significant, but he refused additional sedation, wanting to remain as alert as possible. Meanwhile, Emily received a final round of chemotherapy to prepare her body to accept the donor cells, a dangerous but necessary procedure in her weakened state. By dawn, Richard lay in recovery, sore but determined to be present as his marrow was delivered to Emily. Despite the doctor's protests, he insisted on being wheeled to her room in the ICU for the infusion. Emily had regained consciousness, though she was weak and confused from the fever and medications. When she saw Richard being wheeled in alongside the medical team carrying the bag of harvested marrow, her cracked lips formed a smile behind the oxygen mask. "Is that your blood for me?" she whispered when Richard's bed was positioned beside hers. "It is," he confirmed, reaching across to take her small hand in his. "My very best cells, coming to help yours." Emily's gaze shifted to the bag of bone marrow as a nurse hung it on the IV stand. "It looks like tomato soup," she observed with unexpected humor. Katherine, who hadn't left Emily's side throughout the night, laughed softly through her tears. "Leave it to you to critique the aesthetics at a time like this." As the marrow began to flow into Emily's central line, Dr. Whitman explained the process in terms Emily could understand. "These cells will find their way to your bones and begin making new, healthy blood cells. It will take time, and you might feel worse before you feel better. But this is how the healing starts." Emily nodded solemnly, then looked back at Richard. Her next words landed with the force of revelation, changing everything for him in an instant. "Thank you for saving me, Dad. I always knew you would come someday." Her voice was fading as medications pulled her towards sleep. "Mom said, heroes sometimes arrive at the last minute." As Emily drifted off, Richard felt something crack open inside him, a wall he had spent decades building around his heart. Tears came, unexpected and unstoppable, streaming down his face. He made no attempt to hide them from Katherine, from the medical staff, from anyone. In that moment, Richard Hunter, the man whose ruthless business tactics had earned him the nickname the Terminator in corporate circles, understood with perfect clarity that he had been given a second chance. Not just to be a father to the remarkable child fighting for her life before him, but to be human again. Katherine's hand found his across their daughter's bed, offering not just comfort, but connection. Together, they watched as Emily's future and their own hung in the balance, dependent on the microscopic battle now taking place within her failing body. The next 72 hours were the most grueling of Richard's life, more challenging than the 18-hour negotiations for his first major acquisition, more exhausting than the week he spent restructuring HunterTech after the market crash. Because this time, failure wasn't measured in stock points or profit margins. It was measured in the shallow, labored breaths of his daughter. Emily's body waged war on multiple fronts, fighting the infection while simultaneously attempting to integrate Richard's transplanted cells. Her fever spiked to dangerous levels, then plummeted as her system struggled for equilibrium. Seizures came in waves, each one leaving Katherine and Richard more shattered than the last. Richard refused to leave the hospital, setting up a makeshift command center in a private waiting room near the ICU. His executive team had been instructed to proceed without him, something unprecedented in the company's history. Occasionally, he would take urgent calls in the hallway, speaking in hushed, clipped tones about market positions and competitive strategies that now seemed absurdly insignificant. On the third night, as Richard sat alone in Emily's room while Katherine reluctantly went to shower and changed, he found himself doing something he hadn't done since childhood: praying. Not to any specific deity, Richard Hunter had long ago abandoned organized religion in favor of the certainties of science and economics. But in the sterile quiet of the ICU, watching his daughter's chest rise and fall beneath a tangle of tubes and wires, he found himself bargaining with the universe. Take anything, he thought. My company, my fortune, my reputation, just let her live. The irony wasn't lost on him. Everything he had spent his life accumulating, the very things that had defined his worth in his own estimation, now seemed like acceptable sacrifices for this child he had known for less than 2 weeks. Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open. These moments of consciousness had been rare and brief over the past 3 days. "Dad?" Her voice was barely audible over the hum of machines. Richard leaned forward, taking her hand carefully between his own. "I'm here, Emily." She struggled to focus on him, her pupils dilated from medication. "Are you going to leave again when I get better?" The question pierced him like a physical wound, so direct, so vulnerable, and revealing what must have been her deepest fear since his arrival. "No," he said firmly, surprised by his own certainty. "I'm not going anywhere." A small smile flickered across her pale face. "Promise." "I promise." Richard had made countless promises in his business career, some kept, some strategically broken when circumstances demanded. But this one, he realized, was unbreakable. Emily's eyes drifted closed again, but her fingers tightened slightly around his hand. "Good," she murmured, "because I already told Zach you'd help with his science project about artificial intelligence." Despite everything, Richard found himself smiling. Even at her sickest, Emily was making plans, forming connections, looking forward. "I'd be happy to," he whispered, though she had already slipped back into sleep. The door opened quietly, and Katherine entered, her hair damp from the shower, dark circles prominent beneath her eyes. She moved to the other side of Emily's bed, automatically checking the monitors and IV lines with the practiced vigilance of a parent who had become fluent in medical terminology through necessity. "Any change?" she asked. "She woke up for a minute," Richard replied, "asked if I was going to leave when she gets better." Katherine's expression revealed nothing, but her eyes held a question. And what did you tell her? That I wasn't going anywhere. He met Catherine's gaze directly. I meant it. She studied him, weighing his words. And what does that look like to you, Richard? Not going anywhere? It was a fair question. What did it mean for a man who owned penthouses in 5 countries, whose typical week involved meetings on 3 continents? What did permanence mean to someone whose life had been defined by constant motion? Before he could answer, Dr. Whitman entered with a tablet in hand, her face revealing nothing as she checked Emily's vitals against the latest test results. Her white cell count has stabilized, she announced after a moment. It's still dangerously low, but the free fall has stopped, and her body is showing the first signs of accepting the transplanted cells. Katherine pressed a hand to her mouth, tears forming. Is she going to be okay? Dr. Whitman's professional reserve softened slightly. We're not out of the woods yet. The next 24 hours will be critical, but this is the first positive indicator we've had since the transplant. After the doctor left, Katherine and Richard sat in silence, processing this fragile hope. Outside the windows, dawn was breaking over Cincinnati, the first rays of sunlight slicing through the blinds and casting striped shadows across Emily's bed. You never answered my question, Katherine said eventually, about what staying looks like to you. Richard considered his response carefully. In business, he was known for making grandiose promises to close deals, offering whatever was necessary to secure his objective. But this wasn't business. This was his daughter's life, and potentially his own redemption. I don't have all the answers, he admitted, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. Richard Hunter was a man who prided himself on always having solutions, strategies, definitive plans. But I know I want to be part of her life, a real part, not just financial support or occasional visits when my schedule allows. Katherine nodded slowly. And what about your empire? Hunter Tech isn't exactly headquartered in Cincinnati. Companies can be run from anywhere in the digital age, but they can't thrive without leadership, Katherine countered. You've built your reputation on being omnipresent, on personally overseeing every aspect of your business. Can you really change that fundamental aspect of who you are? The question hung between them, not accusatory but realistic. People didn't change overnight, especially not men like Richard, who had spent decades forging themselves into specific kinds of weapons for the corporate battlefield. Before he could respond, alarms erupted from Emily's monitors. Her body began to convulse, back arching off the bed as another seizure took hold. Medical staff rushed in, pushing Katherine and Richard aside as they fought to stabilize Emily. Richard watched in helpless horror as a doctor administered emergency medications, a nurse increased oxygen flow, another called for additional support. She's crashing, someone shouted, blood pressure dropping rapidly. Richard felt himself being pulled from the room by an orderly as a crash cart was wheeled in. In the hallway, he found Katherine pressed against the wall, her face ashen as she watched through the doorway. This can't be happening, she whispered. Not after the transplant. Not when there was hope. Richard had built his career on taking control of chaotic situations, on bending circumstances to his will through sheer force of intellect and determination. But here, watching through a glass partition as medical professionals fought for his daughter's life, he confronted the ultimate limitation of his power. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, Dr. Chen emerged from the room, his surgical mask pulled down below his chin, his expression grave but composed. We've stabilized her again, he said, but the seizure was severe. We've had to place her in a medically induced coma to protect her brain function and give her body a chance to recover. A coma? Katherine's voice cracked. For how long? We don't know, Dr. Chen answered honestly. It could be days or weeks. Her body needs time to integrate the new cells without the additional stress of consciousness. Richard found his voice at last. What are her chances now? Doctor. Jen hesitated, clearly weighing his professional obligation to honesty against his human desire to offer comfort. If she makes it through the next 24 hours without another major event like this one, her chances improve significantly. The initial signs of cell acceptance are encouraging. He placed a hand on Catherine's shoulder. Emily has been fighting extraordinary odds from the beginning. Don't give up on her now. As the doctor returned to Emily's room, Katherine turned to Richard, her composure finally breaking. He opened his arms without thinking, and she fell against his chest, her body racked with sobs that seemed torn from the depths of her soul. Richard held her, his own tears falling silently into her hair. In that moment, they weren't former lovers or co-parents or adversaries. They were simply two people united by love for the small fighter lying unconscious beyond the glass. I can't lose her, Katherine whispered against his shirt. She's everything. We won't lose her, Richard replied, surprising himself with the use of we, a word that had rarely entered his vocabulary except in formal corporate communications. Emily is stronger than both of us. She'll fight through this. As night fell again over the hospital, Richard and Katherine maintained their vigil, sitting on opposite sides of Emily's bed in the unnaturally quiet room. The ventilator breathed for her now, her small chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. The medically induced coma had transformed their vibrant, curious daughter into a still figure surrounded by the hum and beep of life-sustaining equipment. Richard studied Emily's face, the shape of her eyebrows, the curve of her cheek, the set of her jaw. He saw himself there undeniably, but also glimpsed the strengths that must have come from Katherine. A different kind of strength than his own calculated power, a resilience born of love rather than ambition. She asked me once what her father was like, Katherine said suddenly, breaking the hours-long silence. She was about 5. I told her you were brilliant and determined, that you could solve any problem once you set your mind to it. She met his gaze across the bed. I never spoke badly of you to her, Richard. Despite everything, I wanted her to be proud of where she came from. Richard felt humbled by this unexpected grace. Thank you for that, he said quietly, though I'm not sure I deserved it. It wasn't about what you deserved, Katherine replied. It was about what Emily needed. She paused, then added, if she pulls through this, when she pulls through this, we need to figure out how to be parents together, for her sake. Richard nodded, understanding the magnitude of what she was offering, not forgiveness exactly, but a path forward. A chance to be the father he had never planned to be, but now couldn't imagine not being. I'm selling the New York penthouse, he said abruptly, and the Tokyo property. I've already called my realtor. Katherine looked surprised. Richard, I'm keeping the London flat, he continued, because the European operations need oversight occasionally. But I'm looking at properties here in Cincinnati, something with a yard, room for a dog maybe. Emily mentioned wanting one during one of our chess games. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, Richard interrupted gently. I want to. Not just for Emily, but for myself too. He gazed down at his daughter's still form. These past 2 weeks have shown me how empty my life has been. All the success, the acquisitions, the billions, none of it means anything compared to this. In the sterile quiet of the ICU, as midnight approached and Emily's vital signs remained stable, Richard Hunter, feared corporate raider, ruthless billionaire, newly discovered father, made a silent vow to the universe with which he had been bargaining. If Emily survived, he would become worthy of being her father, not just in name or through financial support, but in all the ways that truly mattered. He would learn patience, compassion, selflessness, qualities that had no place in the boardroom but were essential in a parent. It was the most daunting challenge he had ever faced. But as he looked at his daughter's face, peaceful now in her medically induced sleep, he knew it was the only battle that had ever truly mattered. 1 week turned into 2. 2 weeks became a month. Emily remained in the medically induced coma as her body slowly, painfully integrated Richard's donated cells. The doctors had attempted to bring her out of sedation twice, only to be forced to put her back under when her body responded with seizures and dangerous fluctuations in vital signs. Richard had transformed an entire floor of the residence at Montgomery into a remote headquarters with dedicated satellite connections, multiple workstations for visiting executives, and a legal team permanently installed in what had been the presidential suite's dining room. Ontotech continued to function, albeit with a new operational structure that no business journal could have predicted from the famously hands-on CEO. For the first time in his career, Richard had delegated true authority to his executive team. Weekly strategy sessions were conducted via secure video conference rather than the intimidating round-table sessions in Manhattan where Richard had once reigned supreme. Deals still closed, products launched, stock prices remained stable. The business world was bewildered, but adapting to the new reality of Richard Hunter, remote CEO. Katherine had reluctantly returned to teaching a reduced schedule at the university, her colleagues covering the bulk of her classes while she split her time between Emily's bedside and attempting to maintain some semblance of normality. Richard had offered to cover her salary so she could take indefinite leave, but Katherine had refused, insisting that maintaining her professional identity was important. "I can't just be a mother waiting for tragedy or miracle," she had explained. "I need to remember who else I am." Richard had understood, recognizing in her words a distinction he himself was only beginning to grasp. That identity existed beyond professional accomplishment or parental status. That a life couldn't be defined by a single relationship or role. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Dr. Whitman approached them in the hospital cafeteria, where they had been silently sharing a meal that neither was particularly interested in eating. Over the weeks, they had established a rhythm. Morning updates from the medical team. Then Katherine would sit with Emily while Richard handled urgent business matters, followed by Richard taking the afternoon shift, while Katherine taught her classes or went home to shower and change. Evenings they spent together in Emily's room, sometimes talking quietly about their daughter, sometimes sitting in companionable silence as monitors beeped and medications dripped. Dr. Whitman's expression was cautiously optimistic as she sat down across from them. Emily's latest blood work shows significant improvement. The donor cells are producing healthy white blood cells at a consistent rate. Katherine set down her fork. "And the infection?" "Almost completely cleared," Dr. Whitman confirmed. "Her body is showing remarkable resilience. We believe it's time to attempt bringing her out of the coma again." Richard felt a surge of hope, tempered by the memory of previous disappointments. The last 2 attempts were too early, Dr. Whitman acknowledged, but now her systems are much stronger. All indicators suggest her body is ready. They agreed to proceed that afternoon. As the medical team prepared to gradually reduce Emily's sedation, Richard and Katherine took their positions on either side of her bed, the familiar ritual of waiting and hoping beginning once again. "I found a house," Richard said abruptly, breaking the tense silence as they watched the medication levels being adjusted. "In Hyde Park. It has 5 bedrooms, a large yard, and it's 10 minutes from your place. More importantly, it's in Emily's school district." Katherine looked up, surprised. "You've actually purchased a house here?" Richard nodded. "The closing is next week. I thought—" He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "I thought Emily might like to help decorate her room there once she's recovered." Katherine studied him, as if still trying to reconcile this version of Richard with the man she had known years ago. "You're really doing this?" "I am," he confirmed. "My New York penthouse is already on the market. The Tokyo property sold last week." She shook her head slightly, not in disapproval but in wonder. I'd never thought I'd see the day when Richard Hunter would voluntarily leave Manhattan for Cincinnati. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But priorities change." Before Katherine could respond, a small movement from the bed captured their attention. Emily's fingers had twitched, then slowly, her eyelids began to flutter. The medical team moved in immediately, checking vitals, shining lights into her eyes, calling her name gently. Richard and Katherine were pushed slightly back from the bed, but refused to leave the room entirely. Minutes passed in tense anticipation. Then, finally, Emily's eyes opened fully. She blinked several times, confusion evident as she tried to focus. "Mom!" Her voice was raspy from disuse, barely audible. Katherine moved forward immediately, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here, sweetheart." Emily's gaze shifted, searching the room until she found Richard. "Dad? You stayed." Richard felt his throat constrict with emotion. "I promised I would." The medical team continued their assessments, asking Emily simple questions to check her cognitive function. To everyone's relief, she responded appropriately, showing no signs of neurological damage despite the prolonged coma and earlier seizures. "How do you feel, Emily?" Dr. Whitman asked. Emily considered the question with characteristic seriousness. "Hungry," she finally declared, "and my chess game with Dad isn't finished." A ripple of laughter passed through the room, the tension of weeks breaking like a fever. Dr. Whitman smiled broadly. "I think we can arrange for some Jell-O to start with. Chess might have to wait until you've regained a bit more strength." The next few days passed in a blur of medical tests, gradually increasing physical therapy and cautious celebration. Emily's recovery accelerated once she regained consciousness, her body seemingly determined to make up for lost time. Richard arranged for the best nutritionists, physical therapists, and recovery specialists to supplement the hospital's excellent care, but it was Emily's own determination that drove her progress. 1 week after emerging from the coma, Emily was deemed strong enough for short excursions outside her room. Richard arrived at the hospital to find her sitting in a wheelchair in the hallway, arguing good-naturedly with a nurse about how far she was allowed to go. "I want to show my dad the garden on the roof," Emily was insisting. "It's only 2 floors up, and I've been stuck in that room forever." "Your definition of forever and the medical definition are quite different, young lady," the nurse replied with affectionate firmness. Richard approached, carrying a small gift bag. "Maybe we can compromise. How about the solarium on this floor? It has plants and natural light, and it's only 30 steps away." Emily considered this, then nodded. "Acceptable terms, but tomorrow we negotiate for the roof garden." The nurse looked to Richard with amused exasperation. "She's definitely your daughter. I've never met a more strategic 8-year-old. As Richard wheeled Emily toward the solarium, she asked about the bag in his lap. "Is that for me?" "It might be," he replied, "if you're interested in seeing your new house before we actually move in." Emily's eyes widened as Richard handed her the bag. Inside was a tablet loaded with virtual tours of the Hyde Park house, along with design software specifically for customizing bedroom layouts. "You really bought a house here?" Emily asked, looking up at him with astonishment. "What about your company?" "The company will be fine," Richard assured her. "I can run it from Cincinnati just as well as from New York, and this way I can be close to you." Emily was already scrolling through the house images, her focus intense. "Does this mean I'll have 2 houses? One with Mom and one with you?" Richard hesitated. unsure how much Catherine had discussed with Emily about their future arrangements. "That's something your mother and I still need to work out. But yes, you'll definitely have your own space in both homes." Emily looked up from the tablet, her expression suddenly serious in a way that reminded Richard forcefully of himself. "But you're staying in Cincinnati. You're not going back to New York to live." It wasn't a question, but a statement requiring confirmation. Richard felt the weight of it, the need for absolute certainty from a child who had faced too much uncertainty already. "I'm staying in Cincinnati," he confirmed. "I've already enrolled in the parent association at your school, and I've been researching the best places for chess lessons to continue your training when you're ready." Something in Emily's expression relaxed, a tension releasing that Richard hadn't fully recognized until it was gone. She returned her attention to the tablet, but not before Richard caught the small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Later that evening, after Emily had exhausted herself designing 3 different versions of her potential bedroom and finally fallen asleep, Richard found Catherine in the hospital cafeteria, nursing a cup of coffee and grading papers. "She's out for the night," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "The nurse said her vitals are the strongest they've been yet." Catherine nodded, setting aside her work. "Dr. Yen thinks she might be able to go home in 2 weeks if she continues at this pace. Not back to school immediately, of course, but home care instead of hospital care." "About that," Richard began carefully, "I've been thinking about the transition period. The house won't be fully furnished right away, and Emily will need consistent monitoring." Catherine raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "I've arranged for a medical suite to be installed in your home," he said. "Top-of-the-line monitoring equipment, a hospital-grade bed that doesn't look institutional, and a nurse's station disguised as a normal desk. The team can be there as early as next week to set everything up, with your permission." Catherine stared at him, several emotions crossing her face in rapid succession. "Richard, I can't accept. It's not a gift," he interrupted. "It's for Emily. And it's temporary, just until she's strong enough to divide her time between both homes." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, studying him, as if trying to read his true intentions. Finally, she sighed. "You've really changed, haven't you?" Richard considered the question seriously. "I'm not sure changed is the right word. Emily hasn't transformed me into someone else entirely. I'm still ambitious, still demanding, still focused on results." He paused, searching for the right words. "But she's helped me reprioritize, to see that success can be measured in different ways." Catherine nodded slowly. "When I first saw you in Emily's room that day, I was terrified that you would either walk away again or try to take over completely, that you'd see her as another acquisition." "And now?" Richard asked quietly. Catherine's smile was tired but genuine. "Now I think Emily has exactly what she needs. A father who loves her enough to rebuild his life around her, but who's still strong enough to help her face whatever comes next." Which brings me back to the medical equipment," Richard prompted. Catherine laughed softly. "Fine. Your team can come next week, but tell them not to touch my art studio. That room is off limits." As Richard walked back to Emily's room to check on her one more time before heading to his hotel, he felt a profound sense of peace that had eluded him throughout his adult life. For decades, he had chased the next deal, the next acquisition, the next billion added to his net worth. The momentary satisfaction of winning had always quickly faded, driving him toward the next challenge, the next mountain to climb. But now, standing in the doorway of his daughter's hospital room, watching her chest rise and fall in healing sleep, he understood what had been missing. It wasn't that Emily had changed him fundamentally. Rather, she had awakened something that had been dormant inside him. The capacity to value connection over conquest, presence over possession. Emily stirred slightly in her sleep, murmuring something about chess moves. Richard smiled, thinking of the many games ahead of them, both on the board and in life. He had always played to win, regardless of his opponent. But with Emily, he realized the goal wasn't victory, but engagement. Not domination, but mutual growth. As he finally turned to leave, Richard's phone vibrated with a text from Katherine. "The nurse says her white cell count is normal for the first time. We're really going to bring her home." Richard read the message twice, letting the words sink in. We're really going to bring her home. Not just Emily going home, but a collective journey. We, together, as a family. However unconventional, however unexpected. He typed a simple reply. Yes, we are. And for the first time in his life, Richard Hunter looked forward not to what he could achieve or acquire tomorrow, but simply to being present for it. 6 months later, the autumn sun cast a golden glow across the backyard of Richard's Hyde Park home, illuminating the colorful leaves that drifted down from the massive oak trees. On the expansive patio, Emily sat across from Zach, her brow furrowed in concentration as she studied the chessboard between them. Her hair had grown back in soft auburn waves, and the healthy flush in her cheeks bore no resemblance to the pallor of her hospital days. "Check," Emily announced triumphantly, moving her bishop across the board. Zach groaned dramatically, then brightened as he spotted an escape. "Not checkmate yet." He quickly moved his king to safety. From the outdoor kitchen area, Richard watched the game while preparing hamburgers for the gathered crowd. The monthly remission celebration cookout had become a tradition since Emily's official clean bill of health 3 months ago. Friends from school, fellow patients from the hospital, Katherine's colleagues, and even some of Richard's executives who had relocated to the Cincinnati office mingled throughout the property. "You're burning the veggie burgers," Katherine noted, appearing at his side with a pitcher of lemonade. She wore casual jeans and a light sweater, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, a stark contrast to the exhausted, worried woman he had reunited with in the hospital half a year ago. Richard quickly flipped the plant-based patties. "I still don't understand why anyone would choose these over the real thing," says the man who used to subsist on private chef-prepared keto meals, Katherine teased, her smile easy and genuine. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted. Not romantic. That bridge had been thoroughly burned years ago, but a partnership focused on Emily's well-being that had gradually developed into a friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "Mr. Hunter?" Zach bounded up to the grill, his cancer now in remission as well, his energy seemingly limitless. "Can we use your computer to show Emily the science project animation, please?" "Of course," Richard replied. "It's unlocked in the study. Just don't touch anything else on the desktop. Those are company files." As the children raced inside, Dr. Whitman approached with a glass of wine in hand. She had become a regular at these gatherings, her professional distance giving way to genuine affection for the family whose lives had intersected so dramatically with hers. "Emily looks wonderful," she commented. "Her latest tests are textbook perfect. You'd never know what she went through by looking at her now, except when she decides to lecture her classmates on bone marrow transplantation procedures," Katherine said with a laugh. "Her science teacher called me last week, both impressed and slightly concerned about the level of medical detail in her presentation." Dr. Whitman smiled. "She's certainly taken an interest in medicine since her experience." "She's starting to talk about becoming a doctor," Richard added, arranging the cooked burgers on a platter. "Specifically, a pediatric oncologist. Though last month it was a chess grandmaster, and before that, an AI developer. The privilege of childhood," Dr. Whitman observed. "The freedom to reimagine your future constantly." The comment struck Richard deeply. As a child, he had fixed on a single goal early, financial success at any cost, and had pursued it with unwavering determination. Emily's approach seemed healthier, more open to possibility and joy. The party continued into early evening, with board games, badminton matches, and endless conversations. As twilight approached and guests began to depart, Richard found himself sitting on the porch swing beside Katherine, watching Emily and her school friends chasing fireflies across the lawn. "I got the promotion," Katherine said quietly. "Department chair. They offered it to me yesterday." Richard turned to her with genuine pleasure. "Katherine, that's wonderful. Congratulations." She nodded, her expression a mixture of pride and uncertainty. "It means more responsibility, longer hours. I'm worried about the timing, with Emily still needing extra attention." "We'll make it work," Richard assured her. "That's what co-parenting is about, right? Covering for each other when needed. My schedule is flexible now that the Cincinnati office is fully established." The transformation of Richard's work life had been perhaps the most outwardly visible change in the past 6 months. While still CEO of Hunter Tech, he had restructured the company's leadership, empowering his executive team to manage day-to-day operations, while he focused on long-term strategy and innovation. The business press had initially predicted disaster, but the company had not only survived, but thrived under the new model, with employee satisfaction scores rising and market share growing steadily. "I appreciate that," Katherine said. "It's still strange sometimes, relying on you, after so many years of doing everything alone." "I know," Richard acknowledged, "and I know I can never make up for those lost years. But I can be here now, and for all the years ahead." Katherine smiled, watching as Emily demonstrated to her friends how to capture fireflies without harming them. "She has your focus when she cares about something, absolutely relentless. And your creativity," Richard added. "Did you see the story she wrote for class? The one about the robot who learns to feel emotions? Her teacher sent me a copy. It was remarkably insightful for an 8-year-old. Katherine paused, then added thoughtfully, "She gets the best of both of us, I think. And maybe that's how it was always supposed to be." As the final guests departed and dusk deepened into night, Richard found Emily sitting alone on the garden bench beneath the oak tree, staring up at the emerging stars. He joined her silently, following her gaze to the night sky. "Dad," she said after a while, her voice carrying the peculiar blend of childish wonder and old soul wisdom that never failed to move him. "Do you think my new cells remember being yours?" The question caught him by surprise. "What do you mean?" Emily considered her words carefully. "Your bone marrow is making my blood now. I was wondering if those cells might remember being part of you before they became part of me." Richard was reminded again of how extraordinary his daughter was, always thinking beneath the surface, always connecting dots that others missed. "I don't know, scientifically speaking," he answered honestly. "But I like to think they do. That they carried something of me into you, just as you carried something of yourself into my life." Emily nodded, satisfied with this answer. "That's what I think too." She leaned against his side, and he put his arm around her small shoulders. "I knew you'd come find me someday." "Did you?" Richard asked softly. Even before I got sick. I used to imagine what you were like, what you were doing." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "You're better than I imagined." Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion. "And you're more extraordinary than I could have ever dreamed." Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed in her room, decorated exactly according to her specifications, down to the constellation patterns on the ceiling and the chess-themed bookshelf, Richard sat in his home office, completing a few final emails before calling it a day. A notification appeared on his screen. A donation of $50 million had been successfully transferred to the newly established Hunter Collins Foundation for Pediatric Cancer Research. The foundation had been Richard's idea. But Katherine had insisted on the hyphenated name, arguing that it represented their shared commitment to turning Emily's experience into hope for other families. The foundation would fund not only cutting-edge treatments, but also support services for families facing the financial and emotional burdens of childhood cancer. His phone chimed with a text from James, his head of security, who had become a close ally during the Cincinnati transition. Board approved the family leave policy expansion. Unanimous vote. Press release goes out tomorrow. Richard smiled to himself. The new policy, providing extensive paid leave for employees dealing with family medical crises, had been inspired directly by his experience with Emily. 6 months ago, the old Richard would have seen such a policy as financially irresponsible, an unnecessary drain on company resources. Now he recognized it as an investment in the humanity of his workforce, and ultimately, in the soul of his company. A soft knock at the office door interrupted his thoughts. Emily stood in the doorway in her pajamas, Richard Jr. the otter tucked under her arm. "I thought you were asleep," Richard said, immediately setting aside his work. "I had a dream," Emily explained, padding across the room in her slippers, "about when I was in the hospital and couldn't wake up." Richard tensed, concerned. "A bad dream?" Emily shook her head. "No. I dreamed I could hear you and Mom talking to me, even though I couldn't answer. You were telling me stories and promising I would get better." She climbed onto his lap, something she had only recently become comfortable doing. "Did you do that? Talk to me when I was asleep?" "Every day," Richard confirmed, his voice gentle. "We read your favorite books, told you about our days, promised we'd be there when you woke up." Emily nodded, as if confirming something she had already known. "That's how I found my way back. I followed your voices home." Richard held his daughter close, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a mysterious phone call that had upended his carefully controlled existence to this quiet night in Cincinnati, his priorities and perspective had been completely transformed. Once, Richard Hunter had measured success in billions of dollars, in market dominance, in the fear and respect of his business rivals. Now, success was calibrated differently. In Emily's healthy blood counts, in her laughter as she played chess with Zach, in the sound of her voice calling him Dad. The change had not been without challenges. There were still difficult days, moments when old habits threatened to resurface, when the siren call of total work immersion beckoned, times when he and Katherine disagreed on parenting approaches, when the boundaries of their co-parenting relationship required renegotiation, days when Emily's health scares sent them rushing for blood tests and specialist consultations. But through it all, Richard had discovered something he had never expected to find at this stage of his life: contentment. Not the restless drive for more that had defined his existence for decades, but a deep-seated satisfaction in being exactly where he was, doing exactly what mattered most. Emily yawned against his shoulder. "Will you take me to the park tomorrow to play chess with the old men like you promised?" "Absolutely," Richard assured her. "Though I should warn you, Mr. Levinson is a former state champion. He might actually give you a challenge." Emily grinned sleepily. "Good. I like a challenge. I've reached the end of this story, but I want it to continue through you. If this narrative touched your heart or made you reflect on your own choices, become part of our storytelling community. Press the subscribe button. This small gesture means so much to me. Share in the comments which moment of this journey resonated most with you, and if you've ever experienced a life-changing revelation similar to Richard's. Your stories are the true treasure of this channel. And that's why we continue sharing these narratives week after week, reminding us of what truly matters. Until the next story, which I promise will be as special as you, who has stayed with me to the end. As Richard carried his drowsy daughter back to bed, tucking her in beneath the constellation-patterned quilt, he reflected on the mysterious phone call that had started it all. "Daddy, the doctor says I need you." 6 simple words that had irrevocably altered the course of his life. Need was a concept Richard Hunter had once dismissed as weakness. Now he understood it differently, as the fundamental thread that connected human beings to one another, that gave life its deepest meaning. In the moonlit bedroom, Emily was already drifting back to sleep, Richard Jr. clutched tightly in her arms. Richard brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, overwhelmed by the fierce love he felt for this child, who had claimed him with nothing more than the simple, undeniable truth of her existence. "Good night, Emily," he whispered. "Night, Dad," she murmured, already half asleep. "Love you." "I love you too," Richard replied, the words no longer unfamiliar on his tongue. As he quietly closed her bedroom door, Richard Hunter, billionaire, CEO, and most importantly father, understood that the greatest fortune he would ever amass was not kept in offshore accounts or measured in stock options. It was the treasure of his daughter's love, freely given and gratefully received, a wealth beyond calculation.